Welcome. This is building a progressive web app with Ionic, Angular, and Spring Boot. First of all, thanks for having me at GeeCON. This is the second time I've ever been in Krakow, and unfortunately it's only for 24 hours this time, but the weather is beautiful. And I've really enjoyed just the short time I've been here and seeing all the sites, and it's so green. So that's awesome. Lovely town. My name is Matt Raible. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water, and I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. And yes, it was uphill both ways. I have an unhealthy and expensive obsession with Volkswagens, especially buses and Vanagons. If you have a similar problem, I'd love to talk to you about it. Maybe we can, give each other some therapy. And I work for a company called Okta, and we basically do users in the cloud. So we encrypt all their data and make it very easy to authenticate against our cloud API. You could say we do users as a software service, but if you look at the abbreviation for that, it's UASS, which means UAS. So I don't like to say that because that's not a very good abbreviation. I like to say UMass, user management as a software service. And what's cool about Okta, so I only recently started working there in the last few months. They have a pub in their San Francisco office, in the office. So you gotta like a company that has that. So they have a number of authentication standards that we support when you authenticate against our API. We support OAuth 2, we support OpenID Connect, and SAML. And if you'd like to use us, then I would be glad to help you. But today we're talking about Spring Boot, Ionic, and Angular. And I like the logo for Spring Boot. To me, it's kind of the on and off switch for enterprise Java. You can easily start with Spring Boot, and you get a lot of the features that you normally get with enterprise Java, but it's much simpler and smaller. So it automatically configures Spring whenever possible, and it provides production-ready features such as metrics, health checks, and externalized configuration. On a project that I was on, it was back in 2013, so almost 4 years now. The only reason we even chose to use Spring Boot, they were already using Spring, was just because of its externalized configuration. Because you could have certain spots for your configuration, either in source main resources and in application.properties, or you could override those with environment variables, and it all just worked very easily. So the client really liked that a lot. How many people are currently using Spring Boot? So I'm going to say about half the room. Just to ask about the other technologies as well, how many people are using Angular.js? That's the first version. That's about a third of the room. How many people are using Angular 2? It's like 10 people. What about Angular 4? It's about 5, okay. And anyone using Ionic? Okay, we have a couple of you, so you might know it better than I do, but I've worked with it for a while, so we'll see. Absolutely no code generation is done by Spring Boot. So this is a very different take from Spring Roo, for instance, where they had annotations on a lot of the model objects and then it generated the code at runtime for you. Spring Boot doesn't do any of that. In fact, it's very small to begin with and you build it up as you go. No XML, everything's done in Java config. And one of the unique things that it kind of brought to the table was embedding Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow directly. So Spring Boot wasn't the first one to do this. Drop Wizard also does this. Anyone using Drop Wizard? 4, 5. Vertex? 1. Man, doesn't get much conference love. So one of the things that people really like about Spring Boot is Spring Initializer. Spring Initializer is actually a standalone project that you could download and install at your company or even on your own website, but it basically gives you all the options that you would need to start a Spring Boot application. And not only is it available through the web, it's available through command line like curl or HTTP/IE or basically any sort of command line tool. It's also available in IntelliJ. I think NetBeans has support for it where you can create a new project, you can select Spring Initializer, and it gives you all the options. So a lot of people in Java land are using it. You can see here, this is from 2016 in October. Basically massive adoption of Spring Boot, 250% growth year over year. And I'm sure if we looked at this again this year, it would be similar. I like to say that sales of Spring Boot have skyrocketed. It's easy for a free product, but a lot of people using it. So you can develop a Spring Boot API with minimal code. If it wasn't for getters and setters and toString, you could do it in about 10 lines of code. So you can see there, Spring Boot application is the main annotation. You run it with a public static void main, and then it's got an entity and a REST repository to actually expose that as a REST endpoint. And that's all you need to get started with Spring Boot. So very simple, very easy. You can also do microservices with Spring Boot. So with the Netflix OSS stack, what they've done from the Spring Cloud perspective is they've wrapped a lot of the Netflix OSS stuff. For instance, service discovery with Eureka, circuit breaker with Hystrix, intelligent routing with Zool, and client-side load balancing with Ribbon. And so it makes it very easy to basically have this kind of resilient architecture. On the top there, you'll see the Edge service talks to Eureka, and then the catalog service talks to Eureka as well, and so they handle that self-registration. So that's pretty neat. But there's also secure microservices you can do with Spring Boot. So if you happen to get these slides later, and you happen to click on this image, it'll take you to a tutorial I wrote that I've been asked not to, tell the world, but I can tell most people. But it basically uses the SDKs that Okta provides, and what it does is it uses and integrates with Spring Security. So if you're using Spring Security in front of your Edge service, then basically what it does is it'll take you to a login page, and it'll prompt you, and you basically set up your users on Okta, and it goes and authenticates them, and it doesn't redirect you anywhere, it just authenticates them right in a Timeleaf template login page. And then this is a library that we created called Juicer. It's I forget the name, but it's a combination of Java, Juice from Google, and User. And what it does is it basically takes a JOT that's in a exported user header that is in Zool, and Zool routes for you, and it takes that and turns it into a Spring Security user object. And so it authenticates to the backend. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with Stormpath. Stormpath was a company I worked at before Okta. And so a lot of the things we had at Stormpath have become Okta property. And so all of these tools that are here, we've made work with Okta. So it's pretty cool, it's pretty neat, and works well. And the cool thing is you're still using Spring Security. So you're not actually using anything, you're just dropping in our dependency, maybe you set a couple properties, but then you're using Spring Security, and it's very non-invasive that way. So one of the top open source frameworks, at least self-proclaimed, is from the Ionic folks. And Ionic framework basically allows you to build Angular apps and put them on phones. And it leverages Cordova, which is the open source version of PhoneGap. Adobe bought PhoneGap, and now they have that as a commercial project, and Cordova is the open source implementation. And basically it has APIs, or it has a way for you to talk to the APIs in the phone via JavaScript. And so the cool thing about developing with Ionic is you're just using the tools you know and love: CSS, TypeScript, and HTML. And if you know Angular, you basically know Ionic. So you'll create an Ionic app, there might be some generation commands, but for the most part, it's the same thing as Angular. If you're familiar with Angular CLI, it allows you to generate a project, it allows you to generate components. Ionic has something similar, except in their nomenclature, they generate pages and they generate providers instead of components and services. So if you know Angular well, then chances are you'll be able to develop with Ionic pretty easily. So how many people are doing responsive web design? Okay, we got about 10. I expect you to be a little bit confused. How many people are doing mobile-first web design? Okay, there's about 5. So the difference is responsive web design is developing it on your nice big monitor and then saying, oh, we got to make that work on a phone, right? And so what happens a lot of times is you have these really heavyweight pages that you made work on a phone, and maybe you hid some elements and things of that sort. The mobile-first web design is basically taking the phone first, which means when you test things, you're actually testing on the phone first, or you're testing on an emulator, or you're using Chrome's device toolbar, which has the ability to say, hey, I'm on this kind of phone, and make it look like that, you know, in my browser. The nice thing about doing development in that way is your interface with the product management team is usually much easier because they typically want a lot of things on your page. But when you're trying to fit that into a phone, they just want the actual things that are required. So I encourage you, if you're doing responsive web design, try to do mobile first web design. I know it's hard because we have these big monitors and you're testing on the small device, but chances are you might be able to eliminate some features instead of trying to include everything in there. So unfortunately, we failed on mobile. This is a quote from Alex Russell back in October of 2016 in this YouTube video from a Chrome Developer Summit. And basically he talks about what people really want on mobile is on a 3G connection, that page to load in 3 seconds or less. And there was a DoubleClick report that came out shortly before that talk where basically they found that 53% of sites are abandoned if it takes more than 3 seconds. And the same report said the average mobile sites load in 19 seconds. So we've totally failed. And the reason we failed is because our laptops are filthy liars, right? When we're developing on these high-end Mac Pros or nice Linux machines or whatnot, everything happens pretty fast. And we're using, you know, a fast network. And so we really don't see what a lot of the world is seeing. Now, I think Google has a little bit different perspective than a lot of us because they're developing for the masses, right? They want everyone all over the world to be using their services. And I think a lot of Java developers are typically maybe doing more enterprise. So maybe they do have people with higher end devices and faster connections. But how you can fight back against the mobile that hates you is basically implementing the purple pattern and then getting a really slow, unfortunately, Android phone, you know, a Moto G4, and using Chrome's tools to basically throttle your CPU and to throttle, you know, your network connection. And then there's also Lighthouse, which is a Chrome plugin that you can use to test your application to see if it's implementing the purple pattern. And purple is kind of all wrapped up in progressive web apps. So when you hear people talk about progressive web apps, chances they'll talk about the purple pattern. Purple stands for push, render, pre-cache, and lazy load. So you're pushing the critical resources for that initial URL route. And now that we have server-side push, you can maybe even do that from the server side a little more. You render that initial route, and you'll basically use tools to cache that initial data on the phone. Now, if you're using Ionic, you might install Ionic on the phone via Cordova, but you don't have to. Any website can implement the progressive web apps thing. It doesn't actually have to be, you know, an Ionic app. It can be any Angular app. It could be a Vue.js. It could be React. You pre-cache the remaining routes, so you try to get data before they're actually talked to, and then you lazy load everything else. So it's not one big bundle that gets downloaded at the beginning. So the three components of a progressive web app, you'll see some people say that there's more, but these are like the defining ones, are HTTPS, has to be served over TLS. It has to load while offline, so you don't have an internet connection and it still loads. And then it has a web app manifest. And the web app manifest basically gives the browser the information it needs to install that as an app. So progressive web apps are great, but they don't work on Safari. And so it's one of those things that mobile-wise, right, if you're developing a progressive web app, works great on Android. Windows is adding in Edge, but Apple hasn't quite got behind it yet. So that's where Ionic comes in, is you can still use Ionic to deploy and use these web technologies and have it progressive and have some of the technologies with progressive, but still install it on the phone. Because what happens on an Android phone with a progressive web app is it'll prompt you at the top of the browser and say, do you want to install this app? And if you install it, it'll actually look just like any old app on your home screen. And you load it up, and it's basically a Chromeless browser. It doesn't have a URL or anything like that. So as far as the user's concerned, it looks just like a web app. And you know, it's a lot cheaper to download a mobile web app than it is to download a 60 megabyte native app. So the thing that you really want to see is coding, right? So I'm going to create a Spring Boot API We're going to call this a beer service, and it's going to just bring back a simple list of beers. And then I'm going to create a UI for that with Ionic, and then I'm going to deploy it to iOS. So depending on how much time we have, I have a demo that goes all the way to deploying the server side to Cloud Foundry and then deploying it to my phone. That can take a little while, like 5 minutes. So we'll see. Maybe at the end I can do that, and then we'll take some questions while that's happening. So we're going to have to mirror. And then you probably don't want to see things that big. So let's try making it a little smaller. Okay. How's that look in the back? Thumbs up? All right. So to begin, start.spring.io is one option. Like I said, you can always use IntelliJ as well. I think this is the most visual pleasing because you can switch to the full version and then see, holy cow, options galore. We're not going to choose all those. We're just going to choose a few. So we're going to choose JPA, H2 for an in-memory database. So the problem with H2 you realize is that if you actually run MVN clean on your project, all your data is gone. So it's good for demos, but not good for the real world. REST repositories. And what these allow us to do is basically take a Spring data JPA repository or even other repositories and expose those as REST endpoints. And then we'll do web and then DevTools. And so DevTools is a pretty neat tool where it allows you to actually just recompile your classes and it'll reload your application. So with Eclipse and you save a Java file, it'll recompile it automatically, right? IntelliJ doesn't do that by default, but you can change it to make that work. Quick survey, how many people using IntelliJ? 60% of the room is really smart. How many people using Eclipse? I got like 15 of you. For those that are doing Eclipse, are you writing JavaScript in Eclipse? No. Or you'd switch to IntelliJ, maybe. That's why I switched. Actually, I switched in like 2006. I used Eclipse for like 5 years, and the reason I switched was because Maven support. Right? Way back then, like M2E wasn't that good for Eclipse. And then I got back into web development a lot in 2009, 2010, and that's when I started doing a lot more with JavaScript and HTML, and IntelliJ is just great at that. So we end up with this demo.zip here. And what we're going to do is we're going to end up with two different projects. We're going to have a client project and a server project. So a lot of people in Java land will typically put a client project in a server project. Like if you're doing regular Spring Boot development, you might have a time leaf templates, or you might have JSPs in there, and you basically have your server rendered pages. But when you get with client development and you start using React or Angular, typically what I've seen most people do is have them separate apps, and then use cross-origin resource sharing to talk to one to another. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to start by creating, I already have this project, so it's called Spring Boot Ionic example. And from our downloads, take this demo, put it in there. And I already created the Ionic app, and I'll show you the creation process for that. I only did it like 10 minutes before this. The only reason is because NPM. So when you do an NPM install in most JavaScript projects, it can take anywhere from a minute to 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Because Maven likes to download the internet, but NPM likes to download the internet and invite all its friends and be like, come on. So you can look at a lot of Java or JavaScript projects with Angular or with Ionic and do like a count lines of code, and there's over like 1 million lines of code in node modules, because unlike Maven, it doesn't distribute binaries, it distributes source, and then there's all kinds of code in there. So that's why I did that before. So I'm going to rename this to the server, and then I'll open it up in IntelliJ. So this was a project I did before. I also made the mistake of upgrading Ionic to the latest version like a half hour ago, and IntelliJ to the latest version like 20 minutes ago. So if anything goes wrong, I blame those guys. I neglected to like upgrade my OS, but I like to live on the edge, so that's why I upgraded everything else. So basically what you get with a brand new Spring Boot project is not much at all. You get one Java file and one test file. And that demo application, like I said, just has that public static void main. You can easily add an entity. Oh, and the Spring guys still like tabs. Who's using tabs? We got 5, 6. Okay, everyone else using spaces. So first thing you want to do with your Spring Boot project is say indent with spaces. So create an entity, we'll call it beer. You can see here it's got annotations, JPA annotations for the ID and the name. Pretty simple otherwise. And then we'll create a repository for it. Call it beer repository, and that extends JPA repository. And then we also will annotate that with repository REST resource. And like I said, that exposes the endpoint. If you want to change the API from being /beers, because it'll pluralize it, you can add a prefix to each individual repository REST resource, or you can do it in application.properties and say, hey, here's my prefix. So once you have that, you're going to need some data in there. So we'll use a command line runner. You'll see here, this just takes that repository and, dependency injects it. And one of the new things in Spring 4.3, you no longer need auto-wired or inject annotations. If you're doing constructor injection, you can just set it on the constructor and it'll handle that for you. So that's pretty neat. And then we can basically say, hey, here's a list of beers. So the reason, sometimes I do this and I ask the audience for lists of beers and then we put them in here and it kind of works, but what I do during this demo is I'm not only going to display that list of beers, but I'm going to go out to Giphy and get some images associated with the beer name. And I've done some demos where we can get some beers that bring back some weird images, so I'm just going to go with my pre-canned list here because I know for the most part those are pretty good. So you can see here we have Kentucky Brunch, Brand Stout, Good Morning, very hazy, some funny beer names, and then we have some beers that in the US are not considered great. Maybe you consider them good, but I'm not one of those people. So at this point, we can basically start our application using Maven. There we go. MVN Spring Boot run. And it should print that list of beers right on our console so we can see those. And we'll open a new window so we can see the endpoint, localhost 8080, beers. Back to this one, there they are, it prints them all out. Then we can see it lists all those and uses HotEOS for displaying them, so there's no IDs in there, it's just links to the beers themselves. Well, that's good and all, but what we really need is a controller that just gives us the good beers. So this is beer controller, and we'll go ahead and remove this. And you can see we have a mapping for good beers, and we take that repository, we find them all, and we stream them, and then we look at putting it through a filter that basically says, hey, Budweiser, Coors Light, and PBR aren't that great. PBR stands for Pabst Blue Ribbon. It's one of the worst beers in the world. As far as I'm concerned, maybe other people like it. So now that we have that, we can actually recompile the class. And we can go to good beers. Oh, it's still starting. Come on, boot. There we go. So now it just gives us 4 beers, right? It doesn't give us all of them. So now we have our Spring Boot application. We can go into Ionic, and we can open this up in IntelliJ. And so you see here what I did was this is how you create a new Ionic application. Of course, you'll need to install some dependencies. So if you're using yarn or npm, you'll do npm-g install and then Ionic and Cordova. Those are the two dependencies you need, and you need to install them globally. So I've already done that, so that's why I didn't do it here. But you can see Ionic start, Ionic beer -- version 2. That was what worked yesterday. And today, right before it, it prompted me, hey, there's a new version of Ionic, do you want to use it? So I said, sure. And so now, instead of --v2, it's --type. So Ionic -Angular. To me, that says, hey, we're going to start creating Ionic for other frameworks, right? Instead of just V2 and being stuck on Angular, I wouldn't be surprised if they start developing other support for other frameworks. So once you do that, it basically creates a directory. It also prompts you to see what starter you want to use. And one of their cool new starters is actually an AWS starter. So you can have a full stack framework basically with everything being in the cloud and not being local. So that's one of the features that they support. But then it goes through and it generates everything. It tells you what you need to run. And you can see there it took a little over a minute to do that. So now we have it in our application here. And it generates an app by default. And so this is just how it initializes things. And we can go ahead and run that using Ionic serve. Seems to be one of the problems with updating IntelliJ right away. The terminal is a little slow. Maybe we should just run it outside. There we go. Ionic serve. And you'll see there's not much actually in the application by default. There's a number of tabs and then not real much functionality. But it does look like a mobile app. So it opens up at 8100, and you can see if we use Chrome's device toolbar right here, you can make it look, for instance, like an iPhone 6 Plus, which is really tall. So then we have an About tab down here. We have a contact. We can make that into a little smaller phone. So looks like a mobile app. We're going to add basically, a UI that shows that beer service. So from the terminal, we'll use their code generation tools. So Ionic generate page beer. And so it generates this under the pages directory. You can see that's where it's got its about, contact, home, and all the tabs set up. And then the first thing you'll need to do is it creates a module for those. So if you've done modules with Angular, here's what a module looks like. It declares that page. It has some imports for the routing, and then it exports that page as well. So for this to be recognized by the main application, we have to add it here. Beer page module. And then we can start creating services that we might need. So they have the ability to do Ionic generate provider and then beer. But the problem is it gives it the same file name, beer.ts. It just puts it in a different directory and it puts it kind of nested. So I just like to create the actual providers directory. Providers, and then put a beer service in it. So you'll see here it's injectable. This is similar to, putting a service or repository annotation on a class in Java or Spring. And then I just have a couple URLs here. We're using HTTP because that's how we talk to the server. And then this get good beers returns an observable, and it calls HTTP get, goes to that URL and maps the response to JSON. So one of the things that you'll likely run into is this map right here, this import. When you do this, IntelliJ, for some reason, isn't smart enough to know that is the import. So remember that. If you ever get into this weird error where you see, map not recognized, that's why it happens. Another weird one that's happened with the most recent version of IntelliJ is it won't import response by default. So you can see the error there really doesn't tell you much at all. And it doesn't prompt you to import response. So beware of those two issues. Those can really trip you up. So once you have that, then you can basically go into beer service and start using it. So we can add it as another dependency here, public beer service, and import it. Sorry. And then you'll have to add it as a provider. So one of the errors you might see if you don't is it'll just say, hey, you forgot to add it as a provider, but it does it with a little bit more cryptic information. So you'll notice the other ones didn't need that for nav params and nav controller. That's because they were provided up in the app module. They weren't, you know, they were more global. So once you're there, then you can go, okay, well, let's talk to this beer service and call it get good beers and subscribe. And you can subscribe to the data from that. And then you can say something like this beers equals data. And so then we'll need a local variable for that. So beers array any. That's what that looks like. So what happens with TypeScript is TypeScript actually takes any of your constructors and automatically sets them to local variables. Any dependencies that you pass in the constructor. That's a little bit syntactic sugar. For the most part, this is ES6 that you're writing here, except for the types. Like the array of any is different from ES6 because you just wouldn't have a type on there. So the cool thing about writing TypeScript is you're actually writing ES6 for the most part. It just makes it a little simpler. So once we have that, we can go into our beer list, and we'll change this to beer list like this. And we'll list those beers, right? So I think we're good enough that we could actually see our list. So if we go back here, oh, we haven't done the tabs. So you need to modify the tabs. We'll set it as the second tab. And we'll basically set this one to number 3 and this one to number 4. And then the tab title will be beer. Come on, IntelliJ. And then they're smart enough to have a beer icon, so that's cool. And then you'll have to specify here that you want that to go to a particular tab. So tab 2 is that beer page. Import it. Now we see it here, and we can click on it. I'll take this emulator off so we can see it a little better. And if we click on it, we're like, oh, what? No provider for HTTP. First time you see that, you Google it on Stack Overflow. It tells you what you need. And what you need is in app module, you need to import HTTP module. Come on, prompt me, baby. Not from that one. It's wrong. From that one, Angular HTTP. Now it rebuilds itself. And this time, oh, another error. Access control allow origin. So this is because Spring Boot app doesn't have a cross origination here. Cross origin and origins equal. So with Ionic, it basically has 2 different settings. Obviously, when you're developing with the browser, it's going to be HTTP localhost 8100. But there's also when you connect from your mobile device. What that actually sends is file. I found this out the hard way. So that is an origin header that gets sent from the file unless they fixed that in the last month. But I've just been putting this in here, and it solves the cross-origination problem for the most part. So we recompile that. Wait for it to restart. Okay, now when we click on beer, we probably have to refresh this. You can see we're getting a list of beers, right? It's coming back. So that's kind of boring, though. Let's make it a little more fun with some Giphy images. Always the risky part of the demo. So I'll create a Giphy service.ts. And then you'll notice IntelliJ is prompting me to compile TypeScript to JavaScript. I recommend you don't do this, because what happens if you do it is it'll actually create .js files and .map files right next to your TS files. But IntelliJ is smart enough to hide them as well, so you don't really see them until you check it all on the GitHub, and then you have all these littered files everywhere. In this case, you use an Ionic, or if you're using Angular, you're using that to compile everything, so you don't really need IntelliJ's help. So this Giphy service basically is injectable just like the last one. There's this API here, and this API key is a public key that they've recommended using for demos. So if you're going to put this into your application, you should probably get your own key instead of using this one, or it could shut down at any time. So this basically takes a search term that we pass into it. It makes an HTTP request to that API and then maps a response. And since it brings back a whole bunch of URLs for images, I just grab the first one, and then I return a dancing cat if it doesn't exist for that image instead of just an empty image. So once we have that, we can go back to our page here, and we can add that Giphy service here. And we'll basically loop through and for each beer set a Giphy URL on it. So Giphy service. And then we'll need to modify our HTML to actually show it. And that's how we show it there. And then we're starting to get some funny images here. But you can't really see them, right? We kind of want to see what those look like. So let's go ahead and add a modal so we can edit them. So in here we'll go, oh, you hear that? My fan all of a sudden is like spinning. So this is something that I recommend as well. What happens is when you build things, the modules, IntelliJ doesn't exclude everything, and it keeps trying to show you your node modules, but this, exclude that one, and it brings it back, and then www exclude that one, and that should prevent it from indexing when things change in those directories. So this is basically a way of putting buttons in your title bar. So people have asked me, why do you have 2 buttons? And I think just because I like a plus and I like a beer next to it. Then on the item, we can do a click handler, and we can do a similar open modal. In this one, we're going to pass in data from the actual beer. So ID equals beer.id. And then we can go in here. And have an open modal method. And so this method, you can see, uses a modal controller to create a new modal page, and then it presents it, and then when it dismisses, it also refreshes the list. So we'll need to pass that in as another dependency, public modal. But we still don't have a beer modal page, so we got to create that. Don't you wish you could write code that fast? That'd be awesome. So this takes in beer service, Giphy service, all these parameters, and then it grabs the ID from the nav controller, from the parameters that are passed in, the nav params right here, and it goes ahead and calls the beer service and gets that single beer, and then it sets an href so we know basically how to update it, and then subscribes to that, sets the Giphy URL and all that. And then it saves it, so you can save and edit as well. The beer service doesn't have those methods though, so let's add those. So for get, it just calls the beer API. So instead of calling good beers, it's just calling the beer now. And then for save, it's checking if that href exists. If it already exists, then it knows it should do a put instead of a post. And then it also catches an error if that happens. And then there's also a remove method we can use here. So everything's compiling there. Our beer TS still needs an import for that. And since we're adding new pages, we have to go in here and add a beer modal page. And actually, it's not an export, it's an entry component. So once you have that, then you can create the template for it. Beer modal.html. And you can see here, all this does is it chooses if there's a beer sent in, then it knows to do details versus add. It's got a couple cancel and close buttons that are different for different platforms. And then it has a form, and it uses Angular's familiar syntax for doing basically validation on the form. And it shows an image, and then it allows you to basically save it as long as you've entered in data. So now if we go back here, no provider for beer service. So this is what happens if you put providers on each individual component. So in our beer TS, we have this providers instance, and we're going to put it on our module instead. You could also put it at the app level, and then it would be available to all modules. But you can see here now we can actually see it. Oh, we're getting another cross-origin error down here from Spring Boot. That's because we didn't put it on our REST repository. So this same cross-origin. And then recompile. And now we should be able to see that actual object as well as edit it. So refresh. Here. Good morning. You can see, it's funny because if you change it to good morning 2 and save it, it gives you a whole different one. Good news, everyone. And you can add a new one, like Guinness, one of my favorites. And it's got a beautiful image that kind of makes you thirsty. Guinness. So I do have more of the demo of actually like adding a swipe to delete and stuff like that, but we're kind of running out of time, so I'll just show you, see if I can deploy this to an actual, just the emulator, because doing it to my phone might take a little bit. So you can do Ionic, or no, we wanted to talk about PWAs, right? So to do a progressive web app, Ionic already ships with support for it, so it has this index.html with a service worker already in it. So service workers are one of the main components of progressive web apps, and they allow you to do caching of HTTP requests, so your application can actually work offline. So after we change that, if we go back here, you'll notice in application, it's first of all, it's got service worker installed there, and you can see our service worker is registered here. And if we go up to the manifest, it's got an app manifest. Now it's missing an image, and that's because the manifest references a logo that doesn't exist. So if we go into this manifest.json there, it says assets, images, logo should exist, but it doesn't. So create a new directory called images and put logo in it. And now when we refresh, you can see the icon is right there. There's a couple of flags you have to set. Chrome. These enable add to shelf. You have to set that to enabled and bypass user engagement clicks. Then you reload it. $8,100. And you'll notice it actually prompts you, right, to install it as an app. You can also go into network, offline. The big scary part still works. All right, so it's actually an offline capable web application. And if you close here, you can use Lighthouse to actually test it and see what kind of grade it gets out of 100. So because we're not running on HTTPS, it's not going to give a great grade. But you could deploy this as a Ionic app on the web, but a lot of people are developing it for mobile apps. Now there's also the ability to do it with Electron. So Electron allows you to distribute a Chrome runtime. Slack and Atom, for instance, are written with Electron, and you could deploy the app that way. So to run this on a emulator, you do Ionic, Cordova, emulate, iOS. Oh, it's going to make me install that. That could take a while. So I think this takes like a couple minutes, but there's also another script that I'd like to show you. So in this project, I'll just show you where it exists on the web. Spring Boot Ionic example, there's a deploy.sh that basically deploys to Cloud Foundry and makes it all work, and it'll deploy it to my phone. So we'll try running that and see if that actually completes by the time it's over. So just name it deploy.sh. And it expects the directories to be named Ionic Beer and Server. This guy's still going here. We'll run that one, and then we'll go back to the presentation and see if that all works towards the end. So resources, like I mentioned, that project for doing all that is on GitHub. There's a step-by-step tutorial on the Okta developer blog that I wrote this morning. If you click on that link, it's probably not going to work until one of my colleagues in the US wakes up and actually merges the PR in and deploys the site. So I don't think it'll be up by 5 o'clock, but maybe 8 or 9 o'clock tonight. That will work, and you will be able to read everything that we did here today, as well as see how to deploy to a device and deploy it to Cloud Foundry and all that. Because what happens is you have to change that beer service.ts to actually point to a server in the cloud, right? If you point to localhost 8080, that's not going to work when it gets on your phone. It'll work fine in the emulator, but what you really need is for it to work, when you're on your phone running around. And so one of the things that also happens that I've seen is if your phone is locked, it'll fail to deploy to it. So I'm going to try to unlock mine, and hopefully it'll work. So if you want to learn more about Ionic, I recommend this book. You can see they scratched out 2 and changed it to 3 because Ionic 3 has been released for the last couple of weeks. It's a great book. If you know Angular, you can probably tear through it in a few hours because it's really talking a lot about Angular. So if you don't know Angular, then you can learn Angular via the book, and it just tells you how to do things in an Ionic environment. Shortcut to become an Ionic expert is just write code with it, try it out, and see how it works for you. I recommend checking out developer.okta.com/blog. I've been writing a lot of blog posts for that. If you want to learn how to do just Angular progressive web apps, there's a blog post out there for that. Angular Spring Boot, as well as I have new ones coming up on how you basically build microservices with Spring and microservices with JHipster and deploy that to Google Cloud using Kubernetes. So some kind of fun stuff there that's coming out over the next couple months. I've already written it all. It just needs to go through the editing cycle. So maybe it'll be a couple weeks instead of a couple months. If you'd like to keep in touch, follow me on Twitter. Feel free to contact me on my website. I'll upload this presentation to SpeakerDeck, and you can look at a lot of the examples that I've written on Okta Developer on GitHub. Any questions? We got 2 minutes, so you search for questions, and I'll see if anything's succeeded back in the back here. Make sure my phone's unlocked. Okay, so we got the emulator. So it's running in the emulator. You can see here it's iOS 10.3. We could go change this one again. Oh, you know which one's fun is Corona. If you change that to Corona. That guy's just boozing it up. Ah! And then let's see how we're doing on the Cloud Foundry deploy. It's building iOS, so it's making a production build of the iOS component. And you'll see there it failed. And the reason for this is because you actually have to open the application in Xcode. So CD, Ionic Beer, Platform, then iOS. And it creates an Xcode project here. So you can open My App. And then you basically have to sign it. So Xcode's being updated. That's what failed me. So it does work sometimes. Let's see if I have a version installed on here. I can show you the QuickTime view of it. So QuickTime. Then you can do new video recording. If you have questions, raise your hand. We'll get to you. There's my ugly mug. And you can see here, see all my pictures. I took a picture of some beer last night. This is actually my phone. And it's, oh, you got to click like on the phone, not in the video. Ah, failed. Well, it worked in the emulator. And that script works if you like do the signing in Xcode and all that. So hopefully you enjoyed the talk, and thanks for coming.